I guess you could say I'm a man who likes his peace and quiet, which is probably why I spent 30 years running toward fires, just so I could earn the right to sit on a porch and look at a lake for the rest of my life. My name's Silas Thorne, and for 3 decades I was the fire chief over in Blackwood County, a job that teaches you two things: exactly how fast a dream can turn to ash, and exactly how to find the person holding the matches. After my wife, Martha, passed away 4 years ago, that lake house wasn't an Oppos. Just a building anymore. It was her. Every nail I drove into those cedar planks back in '98, every stone I laid for the fireplace, it was all part of a promise we made to grow old where the water meets the pines. So, when I pulled my old Ford dually into the driveway after a 6-week trip to see my daughter and saw a wrecking ball punching a hole through the master bedroom, I didn't in Oppos. Just see property damage. I saw someone trying to murder my memories. The dust was hanging thick in the humid morning air, that bitter, chalky smell of drywall and pulverized insulation that stays in the back of your throat for days, and I just sat there behind the wheel for a second, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was 6:14 a.m., the sun was just starting to bleed gold over the ridge, and there was this big, ugly yellow excavator sitting right where my rose bushes used to be, its metal claw dripping with pieces of my life. I jumped out of the truck, my boots hitting the gravel hard, and I started screaming for them to stop, but the noise of the diesel engine drowned me out until I climbed right up onto the tracks of the machine and stared the operator in the eyes. He looked more bored than anything, just a guy on a clock, and when he finally shut the engine down, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. I looked past him into the jagged hole where my living room used to be, and I felt the air leave my lungs because right there, half buried under a ceiling joist, was Martha's upright piano. The dark cherry wood was splintered, the ivory keys scattered across the floor like broken teeth, and that was the moment the shock died and a cold, sharp kind of rage took over. This guy in a clean neon vest, looking like he'd never broken a sweat in his life, comes walking over with a clipboard tucked under his arm like it was a shield and a smirk that made me want to see if his teeth were as structural as he thought they were. He tells me his name is Miller, the site foreman, and he has the audacity to ask me why I'm trespassing on a restricted demolition site. I told him, and quote, "Son, you're standing on my soul, and you've got exactly 10 seconds to tell me who told you to touch it before I forget I used to be a man of the law." End quote. He didn't in Oppos. To even flinch, just flipped through his little papers and said they were acting on a court-ordered demolition for a, end quote, high-risk nuisance property, end quote, due to unpaid fees and structural abandonment, issued by the Heron Point Homeowners Association. Now, I knew Heron Point. It was the fancy new development they'd built across the bay with their matching mailboxes and their, end quote, no trucks in the driveway, end quote, rules. But my 12 acres had been carved out of the county map long before those developers ever broke ground. I told them I wasn't in Oppos, part of any HOA, that my land was independent. But he just tapped a document with a forged version of my own signature on it and said, and quote, "The board says otherwise, Mr. Thorne. You're part of the family now, and the family decided your house was an eyesore." End quote. I didn't in Oppos. Argue with him further because I've learned that you don't in Oppos. Fight a fire while you and Oppos. Standing in the middle of the flames. So I backed off, parked my truck at the edge of the property, and watched them work for the rest of the day while I sat in my RV, which had become my makeshift command center. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers trembling just a bit as I started tracing the paper trail because as a fire chief, you learn that every disaster has a point of origin. I started with the county records, calling in a few favors from the old-timers I used to work with, and within 2 hours, I had a PDF of the, end quote, annexation agreement, end quote, the HOA had filed. It was a joke, a sloppy, desperate joke. They'd taken a map of the township, drawn a new line with a digital pen, and filed it during a holiday weekend when the junior clerks were working the desk. But the real kicker was the signature on the demolition permit. It was mine, all right, but it was a carbon copy of the signature I'd used on a generic roofing permit 3 years ago, down to the exact pixel. They hadn't in Oppos. Just made a mistake. They'd committed a felony to get a better view of the lake. I spent the next 3 days living on black coffee and spite, digging through the digital trash of the Heron Point HOA. And that's when I found her, Victoria Vance. She was the board president, the kind of woman who probably measures her neighbor in Oppo's grass with a ruler and has a direct line to the police if a dog barks after 8 p.m. On their private community forum, I found a thread she'd started titled, in quote, "The Lakefront Eyesore Solution," in quote, where she literally complained that my, in quote, rustic, in quote, home was bringing down the property values of her $1 million glass boxes. She wrote, and I kid you not, in quote, "If the old man won in Oppo's, T-Cell we in Oppo's. LL make the property so expensive to keep that he in Oppo's. LL have no choice but to walk away. One way or another, that lot will be our new community park," end quote. It was a land grab, plain and simple, fueled by the kind of suburban arrogance that thinks a title of, in quote, board president, end quote, makes you a god. But Victoria forgot one very important thing about the history of this valley, something the developers had glossed over when they bought the old Miller farm to build Heron Point. See, back in the late 90s, when the original land company went under, the assets were sold off in pieces at a bankruptcy auction, and while everyone was bidding on the pretty lots in the clubhouse, I was sitting in the back of that courtroom with my lawyer, buying the, in quote, boring, in quote, stuff. I called up my old buddy, Leo, in quote, the bear, in quote, Moretti, who's been a title attorney since before I had gray hair, and I asked him to pull the old deed from the Oppo's '96 auction. We spent all night on the phone, and by sunrise, I was laughing so hard I had tears in my eyes. Victoria Vance thought she was playing chess, but she didn't in Oppo's, to even realize I owned the board, the table, and the chairs everyone was sitting on. My 12 acres were the, end quote, anchor, end quote, for the original utility easements, and when I bought the surrounding, end quote, worthless, end quote, buffer zones 25 years ago, I also acquired the private titles to the 2-mile stretch of asphalt they called Heron Point Drive, the only road in or out of their little paradise. I decided to wait for their monthly board meeting to make my move, which was held in their sterile, white-walled clubhouse that smelled like lavender and hypocrisy. I walked in wearing my old work flannels, looking every bit the, end quote, eyesore, end quote, they thought I was, and I sat in the back while Victoria stood at the podium talking about, end quote, aesthetic harmony, end quote, and, end quote, community standards, end quote. When she finally called for, end quote, new business, end quote, I stood up and you could have heard a pin drop. The room got cold fast. She looked at me with this fake, pitying smile and said, end quote, Mr. Thorne, I'm so sorry about your home, but as we discussed, the structural integrity was a liability to the neighborhood. End quote. I didn't in Oppo's say a word, just walked up and handed her a folder. And it was the forensic digital analysis of her forum posts, the proof of the forged signature, and a letter from the county surveyor confirming the illegal annexation. Her face went from pale to a dusty kind of purple, her hands shaking as she looked at the evidence of her own fraud, but she tried to play it off, saying her lawyer would handle these, end quote, frivolous claims, end quote. That's when I leaned in close to the microphone so everyone in that room could hear me, and I said, end quote, Victoria, I'm not here to talk about the house you stole from me. The FBI is already handling the wire fraud and the forgery. I'm here to talk about the road. End quote. She looked confused, squinting at me like I was speaking a foreign language, and I continued, end quote. You see, Heron Point Drive, ISN, and Oppo's a county road. It's a private easement. And according to the deed I've held since 1996, that easement is conditional on and Oppo's mutual respect of property boundaries. And Oppo's, since you decided my property didn't end Oppo's exist, I decided your access to that road doesn't end Oppo's either. End quote. I watched the realization hit the room like a physical blow. The residents started whispering, then shouting, as I explained that as of 8 a.m. that morning, I had officially revoked the HOA and Oppo's right to use my asphalt. I told them I'd be installing a gate at the entrance of the valley, and while I'd allow residents to leave, anyone trying to come back and would be trespassing on my private property. The chaos was beautiful, in a sad sort of way. Neighbors who had spent years reporting each other for the wrong color mulch were now screaming at Victoria for turning their neighborhood into a gilded cage. But I wasn't Oppo's done. I looked the HOA's lawyer in the eye, a guy who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards, and I told him, end quote, and since the utility lines for your water and sewer run through my private buffer zone under a secondary easement that you also breached by filing those fraudulent liens? Well, I'd suggest everyone here stock up on bottled water because my lawyers are filing to sever those connections by the end of the week." End quote. Victoria collapsed in her chair, the end quote, queen of the hill, end quote, suddenly realizing she was presiding over a kingdom with no roads and no plumbing. I walked out of that clubhouse feeling the first bit of peace I'd had since I saw that wrecking ball. But as I stood in the parking lot, looking at the stars, I realized that getting even didn't end Oppos. T bring Martha's piano back. It didn't end Oppos. T unbreak the wood of the house she loved. The fallout was nuclear. The FBI didn't end Oppos. T take long to connect the dots on the forged documents. And it turns out Victoria had been skimming from the HOA and Oppos' legal fund to pay for her own landscaping, which really put the nail in her coffin. She ended up facing a laundry list of charges, and the last I heard, she's serving a 5-year stretch in a federal facility that definitely doesn't end Oppos. T have a Lakeview. The HOA itself went into a total tailspin. They couldn't end Oppos. T collect dues because they were being sued by every resident in the neighborhood, and without a road or utilities, the property values dropped to essentially zero overnight. Eventually, a court-appointed receiver stepped in, and I made them a deal. I'd reinstate the easements and the road access, but only if the HOA was permanently dissolved and replaced with a simple, voluntary road maintenance agreement. No rules, no boards, no Victorias. I took the massive settlement from the insurance company and the civil suit against the board members. Nearly $2 million when all was said and done, and I started over. I didn't end Oppos. T built a mansion. I built a small, sturdy cabin right on the same footprint where the old house stood. It's got a wraparound porch and a state-of-the-art security system. But more importantly, it has a brand new upright piano in the corner. Sometimes when the wind is just right and the lake is quiet, I sit out there and think about how people get so caught up in the end quote, rules and quote, of their little worlds that they forget the ground beneath their feet belongs to someone else. I've had a few neighbors from Heron Point stop by, people who used to look the other way when Victoria was being a tyrant, and they usually bring over a pie or a six-pack, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. I accept the peace offerings, but I always remind them, a fence doesn't end Oppos. T make you a good neighbor, and a clipboard doesn't end Oppos. T make you a boss. It's the way you treat the people around you when you think you have all the power that really defines who you are. So I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in my boots? Would you have gone for the throat like I did? Or would you have just taken the insurance money and moved on to somewhere less complicated? It's easy to talk about, end quote, taking the high road, end quote, until someone tears down the walls of your life while you're not looking. Is justice really served when you have to break a whole neighborhood just to fix what was stolen from you? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I went too far or if Victoria got exactly what was coming to her. I'll be here on the porch, watching the gate and listening to the music. Would you have fought for the land or for the principle? Len Oppos, let's talk about it.